Thank you, Gary, and thank you, Gabe. I started to tear up a little bit too, I have to be honest there. So, can I get my slideshow up? There we go. Like Gabe was talking about, I was one of those young men just like him who grew up with internet in the home. I was among that first generation. I had access to internet porn from an early age, and by the time I was a teenager, I had developed porn-induced erectile dysfunction. But I'm not actually here to tell my story today. I'm here to explore briefly what we now know about how long-term porn use impacts the brain neurologically. And why, like Gabe said, in 2015, by now, studies are showing us that around 30% of young guys 18 to 40 are experiencing erectile dysfunction, when just 13 years before, those rates were 2 to 3%. What happened in just 13 years to cause all that drastic change? Well, in 2006, YouTube-style streaming internet porn sites started to go live and unleashed a tidal wave of internet porn upon the world and upon the youth. So symptoms that can come about due to chronic porn use include chronic ED, which is, I'd like to reinforce, ED with a partner. So a lot of these guys can still get erect and still orgasm to porn, but when they go to have an intimate situation, a sexual encounter with an actual person, it just doesn't work. These other brain changes and symptoms also tend to arise for myself and for a lot of guys. We only realize there's a problem when our erections stop working. And then we seek answers and we realize it's probably the porn. And once we quit, we start to realize that, oh my gosh, porn had all these other effects like brain fog, lethargy, social anxiety, depression. We start to experience emotion on a deeper level and have an enhanced capacity for empathy and actually connecting with people in relationships. And we realized that a lot of our sexual tastes weren't innate, but they were conditioned by the pornography, and that once we quit, those tend to return to a more natural state. So why does all this happen? Well, like Abe was saying, neuroplasticity. We now know that over years, consistent behaviors like porn use can actually alter structures in the brain. Now, this is a representation of the reward circuit in our brains. This is a collection of structures that are evolutionarily ancient and shared among mammals. Here is a simpler representation of that circuit in the cross-section of a human brain. Now, this is where our moods arise out of. It's where our emotions are. It's the seat of our desires and our motivations. It's where we fall into and out of love, and it's where addiction happens. It's because of this reward circuit that we are impelled toward things that are pleasurable and away from things that are painful. It impels us toward rewarding behaviors like eating and bonding with others, achievement, taking risks, play, sex, and importantly, novelty. Now, we are wired to be inquisitive and curious and seek novelty so that we can do things like find new territories, new food sources, and novel mates. Dopamine is a neurochemical that largely powers this reward circuit. It is the craving neurochemical that when we get a spike of dopamine in our reward circuit, it tells us, I've just got to have that, whatever that thing is, whether it's the next potato chip in a potato chip bag, or a cool drink on a hot day, or an attractive coworker, or the next video clip on a streaming porn site. Now, it's important to note that dopamine is not associated necessarily with pleasure or with satisfaction, but rather with wanting and seeking and craving. It's released in anticipation of something satisfactory. Now, it's other neurochemicals like endogenous opioids and endocannabinoids that are released after something like a satisfying meal or an orgasm that make us feel satisfaction and temporarily stop us from seeking and craving. But here's the kicker, is that the dopamine system is stronger than the opioid system, and we seek more than we're satisfied. It's more advantageous from an evolutionary perspective to be seeking and doing things than just sitting around in a satisfied stupor. And that's why strong stimuli like concentrated fats and sugars that release a large amount of dopamine can override our feelings of satisfaction. when we're full after a meal and we tell everybody, oh, I can't eat anymore, but then we see the chocolate cake, we end up ordering dessert anyway. Now, this experiment demonstrates the power of dopamine. If we hook up an electrode into the reward circuit of a rat's brain and allow him the ability to activate that by pressing a lever, he will press that and continue to press it, ignoring real stimuli like food and receptive females until he collapses of exhaustion, and he will literally die of starvation. Not because it feels good, like I said, but because it makes him feel like he is just about to accomplish something really important, like eating some cheese or having some sex. But he's not. His brain is being tricked into believing it's about to accomplish something valuable, not unlike a serious addiction or searching for that perfect clip to finish to online. On the other hand, if researchers block dopamine in the brain, the rat loses all motivation to do pretty much anything. If we put food in his mouth, he will chew it and he will swallow, but if the food is across the cage from him, it's just too much effort. He will literally die of laziness. Now, natural rewards like food or social acceptance, they're vital, but passing along our genes is biologically our #1 mission, so sexual cues produce the highest amount of dopamine release in the reward circuit of any natural reward. If we look at addictive drugs like morphine and cocaine, morphine raises dopamine about the same as sex, whereas cocaine sends it skyrocketing to over 300% of baseline. And these drugs, they're only addictive because they hijack our reward circuit. They hijack these systems that evolved to impel us toward natural good things like seeking friendships and sexual relationships and accomplishing things. And these drugs take that and offer us pleasure, temporary pleasure, that doesn't actually mean we're doing anything important. Internet porn users can do much the same thing, keeping their dopamine levels elevated for hours at a time by constantly clicking to new content. There's an unlimited stream of novelty, finding new genres, new porn stars. And this behavior is called edging, and it can be indicative of a problematic relationship to porn. Internet porn, it encourages this type of behavior because of something we know as the Coolidge effect. So if we place a male rat in a cage with a receptive female rat, we will at first see a frenzy of copulation. They'll both be excited. The male struggles gallantly to fertilize the female. But after a while, even if she is still into it, he will start to lose interest. He'll get bored. Replace her with a new female, and his enthusiasm spikes back up again, and he'll once again struggle to fertilize her. And you can repeat this process as many times as you like until he collapses from exhaustion. Now, what's actually happening is that when he first sees that first female, he gets a big spike of dopamine, tells them, I want her. But with successive sexual encounters, the dopamine levels in his brain get lower and he gets less excited. But introduce a second female, and we see a spike almost as high as for the first female. Novelty. Now this mechanism evolved to help encourage genetic diversity in the animal kingdom and also to ensure that no willing and fertile female went unfertilized. But these are rats. What about in humans? Well, these Australian men, their subjective arousal and their penile circumference were measured as they were shown porn. And you can see their arousal and their erections go down as they're showed the same porn. But as soon as they're introduced to novel content, we see a spike in subjective arousal and erectile strength. And this novelty isn't just for new partners or porn stars, but new settings, new genres, etc. Now, the modern sexual environment for a lot of people, especially young people, is to go online and seek out that perfect video to masturbate to and orgasm to. And often these people, they go online and they have multiple tabs open, each with a short 3-minute video, multiple porn stars, or watching compilation clips like Gabe was talking about, where scenes, all the best moments from different scenes are spliced together into one video. So people can sit down and in one sitting see dozens or hundreds of different attractive mates all performing a lifetime's variety of sex acts in one sitting. Now, compare this to the evolutionary history of our species. What environment did we evolve in, or did our ancestors live in? How many potential partners would they have had? How much sexual stimulation would they have had? And we see that internet porn is an explosion of stimulation compared to what our brains evolved to handle. I believe Gabe mentioned this. Internet porn is a supernormal stimulus. It's an exaggerated version of natural cues that we find compelling. Other examples of supernormal stimuli are fast food or junk food, which has highly concentrated forms of fats and sugars and salts beyond what we would find in the natural world. Gambling machines that are literally designed to be addictive. Video games that might make us feel like we're about to accomplish something really important, like saving the world or forming relationships, but we're actually just clacking away at our keyboards. Animals, too, are vulnerable to this. If you saw Dr. Hilton's talk yesterday, he mentioned this as well. Shorebirds will abandon their real eggs to incubate larger, more colorful fake plaster eggs created by scientists. And the male jewel beetle will happily copulate with a brown beer bottle because to him, this looks like the biggest, sexiest, most amazing female he has ever encountered. And all these beetles, they're just responding to cues that they evolved to respond to because it was advantageous to them. But now that they're encountering this supernormal stimulus, it's leading them literally into a dead end. I think you know where I'm going with this. Is copulating with a beer bottle really all that different from copulating with an inanimate computer screen? Now, what is addiction? It's been mentioned a lot today. Well, according to the American Society of Addiction Medicine, which is a collection of medical doctors, addiction is a primary chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. And this means that addiction is a singular disease, a singular disorder, no matter what the object of that addiction is, whether it's a substance like alcohol or cocaine, or a behavior like gambling or sex or porn. And all these addictions are characterized by the inability to consistently abstain, impairment in behavioral control, cravings, diminished recognition of one's own behavioral problems, and a dysfunctional emotional response. And all addictions demonstrate the same general brain changes that we can observe. Now, these include sensitization, desensitization, hypofrontality, and an altered stress response. Now, I'm going to go through these one at a time. I don't expect you to understand them right away. So sensitization, which in the case of internet porn is also sexual conditioning, is the brain's process of responding to that dopamine spike by reinforcing that behavior because it's rewarding. We get that hit of dopamine and it tells our brain, this activity, what we're doing right now, that's really valuable. We should do that again and again. Dopamine tells us that we can remember and repeat that. Now, in a human-to-human sexual relationship, this process would condition us for the sensual cues that normally lead to sex. So, someone might, for instance, become conditioned to the sound of a lover's voice or the scent of their hair, and these stimuli would produce an arousal response. But when people use internet porn, they condition themselves instead to those cues, like being at home alone with a computer, opening up a private browser window, or seeing a sexy pop-up or sidebar. And these things can produce powerful cravings. Here's one guy's experience. I relapsed to porn once, and even though I didn't get fully erect, I could not believe the intensity of the rush I got when I clicked to the site. Very powerful excitation. Tingling, dry mouth, even trembling. Now, these brain studies out of Cambridge show us a little bit more in picture form what this looks like. They compared healthy controls to compulsive porn users and looked at their brains and how they responded in response to porn. Now you can see the healthy volunteers, their reward circuit lights up when they're shown porn. They're responding. But we look at the compulsive porn users, and theirs light up to a much greater degree. And this means subjectively these people are feeling increased cravings and increased desire. And this is exactly the same process we see in drug addicts who are exposed to cues related to their drugs or their addiction. The researchers there also noted that the compulsive users might have wanted the porn more, but they weren't actually enjoying it any more than the healthy controls, and they were never really satisfied with what they were consuming. Neuroplasticity. All this can happen because our brain is able to grow and change as we grow and change. We create new pathways in our brains when we learn new skills, like learning a language or learning to juggle, and old pathways that we don't use anymore become weaker and degrade over time. We call this rewiring. And these pathways are competitive. So visualize here two pathways, sexual pathways, one for porn and one for real sex and real intimacy. As someone uses more porn, that pathway becomes stronger. They become conditioned to those cues. And the pathway for real people and real sex weakens. And over time, that doesn't look quite right. Over time, that real pathway can become so weak that it results in sexual dysfunctions like we've been talking about, porn-induced erectile dysfunction. A real sexual encounter doesn't contain any of the cues that my brain becomes aroused by. It doesn't contain the unlimited novelty of internet porn, or the sitting position, or the complete voyeuristic control, none of the same visual sights or sounds. So there's no arousal response. Now, case in point, 60% of those compulsive users at that Cambridge study had porn-induced ED or low libido for real partners. And it wasn't organic. They could still get aroused and orgasm to porn, but not during real sex. The good news is, like Gabe said, this is reversible. The brain can change and grow. So we quit using porn. That pathway weakens over time, allowing us to strengthen the pathways for real people and real intimacy and real relationships. Desensitization is that second brain change I want to talk about. Addicts get sensitized to their addiction, but everything else becomes desensitized, and that the addiction does too, eventually. So the addiction becomes the high point in someone's day, and everything else is a little bit more grayed out and numbed. The homework might be important, but it's just not nearly as stimulating as internet porn, and it's hard to get excited or motivated to do much of anything. Now, to understand why this happens, let's look at how neurons communicate. All right, so we have one neuron, neuron number one. It releases a signal in the form of a chemical, dopamine. And the signal goes across this gap called a synapse. And the second neuron picks it up with receptors. Think of those like ears that pick up the message and listen to it. A decline in the number of connections between neurons, the amount of dopamine available to release, or the number of receptors available to listen to that message, a decline in any one of those can lead to a weaker message. So what happens when we overstimulate this system over time? Well, if someone is screaming at you for a long period of time, you're going to cover your ears. And the same general thing happens on a neurological level. We overstimulate the system, and in order to protect itself from that overstimulation, we get reduced amount of dopamine and reduced amount of receptors available to pick up that message. And the same thing likely happens with other reward and pleasure neurochemicals, not just dopamine. On a long-term scale, that's not the only thing that happens. Also, entire connections are trimmed, and they disappear. And this results in an observable loss of gray matter in the reward centers of the brain. And that's just what this study out of Max Planck Institute in Germany found. They didn't compare healthy controls with compulsive porn users. They just took people and correlated the changes in their brain that they could observe through brain scans with how much porn they were consuming. And they found that the more hours per week that people watched porn and the more years that they had consumed porn correlated with a reduction in gray matter in a specific part of the reward circuit. Now, what does this mean? Well, lead author Simone Kuhn says that could mean that regular consumption of pornography more or less wears out your reward system. And it's not like it's just worn out for porn or for sex, it's worn out for everything. And that's why we see desensitization and lower motivation and ambition. People who are addicted also get desensitized to the object of their addiction, and that's called tolerance. It's needing more in quantity or quality to reach that same level of high or pleasure that we started to get when we first started using. And a drug user, that might mean using more of the drug or a stronger drug. And in an internet porn user, that might mean spending longer looking for that perfect video clip or escalating in terms of genre and extremity of content. And that works because when we pair arousal with novelty and strong emotions like shock and surprise and anxiety, that can heighten the arousal response and create a stronger dopamine message in our brains that they now need to get aroused. And how do we know if a sexual interest or a fetish is porn-induced? Well, take away the porn, wait a few months, and if it fades away, then it was porn-induced. That same study out of Germany showed our third brain change, which is hypofrontality. Hypo means below normal or deficient, and the frontal part of it refers to the frontal lobes of our brain and the prefrontal cortex. And this part of our brain is largely what makes us special among the animal kingdom. It's where we have our faculties of planning and rational thought, prediction of consequences, and importantly for this, self-control and willpower. Our survival-oriented reward circuit is telling us to eat that piece of chocolate cake, but our diet and weight-oriented frontal lobes hold us back. But when hypofrontality occurs, that process weakens. That connection between the frontal lobes and the reward circuit is weakened, leading to a lessened ability to control use, to predict consequences, and to make rational choices. And that study found exactly that. The more porn people used, the more porn they consumed, the worse that connection between the prefrontal cortex and the reward circuit became. Here's a quote. Dysfunction of this circuitry has been related to inappropriate behavioral choices, such as drug seeking, regardless of the potential negative outcome. And that fourth brain change, the altered stress response. Well, we have limited time today, and we've just skimmed the surface of how addiction changes the brain, but one of those ways is to rewire a stress response so that stress or anxiety or negative emotions like that actually produce cravings. Simply put, our brain knows that one thing always makes it feel better, so when we have a negative emotion, we go to the object of our addiction to make us feel better. So when we quit, that activates the stress response system. Withdrawal from an addiction activates the stress response system, and that's where a lot of those strong cravings come from after quitting, and that's where a lot of the other withdrawal symptoms come from as well. So what are we left with here? Well, we have a desensitized brain that's saying, I just can't get no satisfaction. And the sensitized part is saying, hey buddy, I got just what you need. Hypofrontality is calling out, I know it's a bad idea, but I just can't do anything to stop you. And those dysfunctional stress circuits are screaming for something to take the edge off right now. So we're left with someone who is less able to control their use, less able to foresee the consequences of their behavior, and their addiction reinforces itself. So I want to go over a few things that we've already talked about just in review. Addiction is one disorder. It's one disease, no matter what the object of that addiction is. And we need to treat it that way. It's characterized by similar symptoms across addictions and similar brain changes across addictions. We have over 170 internet addiction and porn addiction, specifically brain studies that all support these findings. People don't actually have to be addicted to experience these brain changes and these symptoms. Some guys, once they realize porn is what's ruining my life, they can quit right away, and they don't have to struggle with relapse after relapse. But even though they're not addicted, it still causes those symptoms and brain changes. Quitting porn use can, over time, reverse a lot of these symptoms, cause them to remit. Women also can and often do develop these same unhealthy behavioral patterns with pornography and develop many of the same sexual dysfunctions. Obviously not erectile dysfunction, but they do develop an inability to have an orgasm with a partner or maintain arousal during real sex. And this has been a quick overview of the science. I'd like to encourage you to check out this paper, is Internet Pornography Causing Sexual Dysfunctions, a review with clinical reports, a review of a lot of the research that I've been talking about, and a lot more. And I'm not the first to collate all this information. A lot of these slides were adapted from Gary Wilson's site, yourbrainonporn.com, which is an excellent resource for anyone who wants to learn more about this. And I highly recommend his book, Your Brain on Porn, for a great read. My own work is at addictedtointernetporn.com.